You need a wife and mom needs help. Poor black girl told the rich duke. The church bell tolls across a cold frontier town. Dust swirls as a carriage stops in the street. A poor black girl, carrying buckets of water for her sick mother, stumbles before the richest man in the county. Laughter from the townsfolk cuts like knives until she blurts the words no one expected. You need a wife, and mom needs help. The crowd falls silent. The wealthy duke steps down, but instead of scorn, he takes her hand. Whispers spread like wildfire. Has the mighty man's heart been captured by the poorest girl in town? Or is she about to be destroyed by lies too powerful to fight? When a forged letter brands her a schemer, and the stagecoach door closes on her future, thundering hooves race against time. Will love and truth be strong enough to shatter scandal, or will a cruel world tear them apart forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind whipped across the Colorado settlement, carrying the bite of approaching winter. Sarah May's fingers, raw and bleeding from the cold, gripped the heavy wooden buckets as she made her way from the creek. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, but the thought of her fevered mother lying weak in their drafty cabin drove her forward. Ice had formed along the bucket rims, and Sarah's threadbare shawl did little to ward off the morning chill. The settlement was just stirring to life, smoke rising from chimneys as the more fortunate townsfolk enjoyed their warm hearths. Sarah's shoulders ached from the weight of the water, but she couldn't rest. Her mother needed fresh water for drinking and cool compresses. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. The wooden handles of the buckets had worn grooves in her palms over the past weeks of endless trips to the creek. But what choice did she have? With her mother too weak to work, Sarah bore the burden of their survival alone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. A fine carriage rounded the bend, its polished wood gleaming even in the weak autumn sunlight. Sarah tried to step aside, but her foot caught on a frozen rut in the road. She stumbled, one bucket slipping from her grip. Water and mud sprayed across the road just as the carriage drew near. The driver pulled hard on the reins, and the horses reared slightly, their hooves dangerously close to where Sarah had fallen. Her heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet, aware of the growing crowd of onlookers gathering to watch the scene unfold. Inside the carriage sat Duke Harrison Caldwell, known throughout the territory as the Rich Duke for his vast cattle holdings. His expression was stern as he looked out at the disruption, his fine wool coat and perfectly knotted cravat marking him as a man of means and refinement. "Well, if it ain't the May girl, causing trouble again," came a mocking voice from the crowd. Others joined in with derisive laughter, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. But as she looked at the Duke's face, proud, aloof, yet somehow carrying a shadow of loneliness, something sparked inside her. Perhaps it was desperation, or maybe divine inspiration, but words burst from her lips before she could stop them. "You need a wife," she declared, her voice trembling but fierce, "and mom needs help." The laughter died instantly. The morning air grew thick with shocked silence as Sarah stood there, shaking from both cold and boldness, her words hanging in the still air between them. Duke Caldwell's expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. For a long moment, he simply studied her, taking in her worn dress, her bleeding hands, the determination in her young face. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he stepped down from his carriage. His boots crunched on the frozen ground as he approached her. Sarah held her breath, certain she'd gone too far, that her impulsive words would bring punishment down on her and her mother. But when he reached her, he simply bent down and picked up her fallen bucket. "Allow me to escort you home, Miss May," he said, his refined voice carrying clearly to the watching crowd. "These buckets appear rather heavy for one person to manage alone." Sarah stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. The Duke, the wealthiest man in the territory, was offering to help her carry water. The townsfolk began to whisper among themselves, their earlier mockery replaced by bewildered speculation. With gentle firmness, Harrison steadied Sarah with one hand while holding the bucket in the other. "Lead the way," he said quietly, ignoring the growing chorus of whispers from the crowd. Sarah's legs trembled as she took up her remaining bucket. Side by side, they began walking toward her cabin, leaving behind a wake of astonished faces and furiously wagging tongues. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows behind them as they made their way down the muddy road, the unlikely pair drawing every eye in the settlement. Sarah pushed open the cabin door, its hinges creaking in protest. The Duke had to duck slightly to enter the humble space, and Sarah felt a fresh wave of shame at their meager surroundings. A weak fire sputtered in the hearth, barely warming the single room. The walls were lined with rough-hewn logs, gaps stuffed with mud and straw to keep out the wind. Margaret May lay propped up on her thin mattress, wrapped in every blanket they owned. When she saw the Duke enter behind her daughter, she tried to sit up straighter, a racking cough shaking her frail body. "Your Grace," Margaret managed between coughs, "we are honored, but—" She looked around their poverty with embarrassment clear in her fever-bright eyes. Harrison Caldwell set down the water bucket, his gaze taking in the sparse furnishings, a single table, 2 wooden chairs, and a few cooking implements hanging from rusty nails. The fine wool of his coat seemed almost to glow in the dim light, so out of place in their humble dwelling. "Madam," he said, his voice gentler than Sarah had heard it before, "please, do not trouble yourself." He turned to Sarah, who stood nervously twisting her apron. "Miss May, fetch Dr. Wilson at once. Tell him the Duke requires his immediate attendance." Sarah hesitated, her face flushing. "Sir, we cannot afford—" "Go," he commanded, though not unkindly. He pulled out a leather purse and pressed several coins into her hand. "This will cover the physician's fee. Make haste." Sarah clutched the coins, more money than she'd held in months, and hurried out the door. The cold air stung her cheeks as she ran toward town, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and disbelief. When she returned with Dr. Wilson, the Duke had stoked the fire to blazing and added several logs from their dwindling woodpile. The physician set to work immediately, his weathered face grave as he examined Margaret. "Severe congestion in the lungs," Dr. Wilson muttered, reaching for his medical bag. He withdrew glass cups and a small flame, beginning the cupping treatment on Margaret's back. "This will help draw out the illness." Sarah watched anxiously as the doctor worked, applying the cups and then preparing a bitter tonic from herbs and powders. The Duke stood by the fire, his expression unreadable as he observed the procedure. "She must take this tonic 3 times daily," Dr. Wilson instructed, handing Sarah a small bottle. "Keep her warm, well-fed, and rested." He packed away his instruments, accepting payment from the Duke with a respectful nod. As the reality of this unexpected kindness washed over her, Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his Averkias not him, shoulders stiffening. "I did only what any decent man would do," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. But Sarah caught something in his expression, a softness, a hint of warmth that belied his gruff words. For just a moment, she glimpsed past the proud exterior to something gentler underneath. "Nevertheless," Margaret said softly from her bed, "we are grateful." The Duke nodded curtly. "I shall send more firewood tomorrow. Good evening, ladies." He turned and strode out, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Sarah moved about the cabin, tucking the blankets more securely around her mother and adding another log to the fire. The room felt warmer now, not just from the flames but from the lingering effect of unexpected kindness. Kneeling beside the bed, Sarah clasped her hands. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "thank you for sending help when we needed it most." Margaret reached out to touch her daughter's cheek. "Sarah," she murmured, her voice weak but thoughtful, "no man of wealth acts with such kindness without reason." Her eyes, though tired, held a knowing look. "Especially not a man like Duke Caldwell." Sarah thought about the softness she'd glimpsed in the Duke's eyes, so at odds with his reputation for cold pride. She tucked the blanket more firmly around her mother's shoulders, wondering what tomorrow might bring. Morning sunlight filtered through the worn shutters of the May cabin, casting thin strips of gold across Margaret's sleeping face. Sarah touched her mother's forehead gently, relief flooding through her at the cooler temperature. The fever had finally broken during the night. "Thank the Lord," Sarah whispered, adjusting her mother's blankets. The woodpile by the hearth was higher than it had been in months, thanks to the Duke's promised delivery. Margaret stirred, opening her eyes. "You look stronger today, Mama," Sarah said, spooning some broth between her mother's lips. Strong enough that you need not fuss so, Margaret replied with a weak smile. We're nearly out of flour, child. Best go to town while I'm well enough to manage. Sarah hesitated. Are you certain? Go on now. I'll rest quiet as a church mouse. Gathering their meager coins in a worn basket, Sarah set out toward town. The morning air held a bitter chill, but the sun promised some warmth later. As she approached the cluster of wooden buildings that made up the settlement's center, she noticed small groups of women gathered, their heads bent close in conversation. There she is now, one woman whispered loudly as Sarah passed. Bold as brass, throwing herself in front of the Duke's carriage. Aiming to trap herself a rich man, no doubt, another added with a sneer. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high and her steps steady. At the general store, she pushed open the heavy door, the bell announcing her entrance. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, barely acknowledged her presence. While waiting for her flour to be measured, Sarah couldn't help but overhear two well-dressed women talking by the fabric counter. Miss Whitcomb arrives on today's coach from Boston, one said excitedly. The Duke's betrothed, you know, they say she's quite the beauty. High time too, her companion replied. He's delayed the wedding long enough. But then, she brings connections to the finest Boston families. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted her paper-wrapped flour. Betrothed. Of course he was betrothed. What had she expected? Still, the news settled like a stone in her stomach. I shall simply ignore it, she whispered to herself. It matters not at all. Meanwhile, across town, Harrison Caldwell sat astride his horse, watching the road where the Boston coach would arrive. His collar felt unusually tight, and he tugged at it irritably. The thought of Lillian's arrival filled him with a familiar sense of resignation. The engagement had been arranged by their families years ago, a business arrangement more than a romance. Lillian was everything society demanded, beautiful, accomplished, and from an excellent family. Yet Harrison had found endless reasons to delay the wedding, unable to shake the feeling that something essential was missing. The sound of wheels and horses' hooves announced the coach's approach. Harrison dismounted, straightening his jacket as the vehicle pulled to a stop in a cloud of dust. The door opened, and Miss Lillian Whitcomb descended like a queen from her throne. She was as lovely as ever in an expensive traveling dress of deep blue silk, her blonde hair arranged perfectly despite the long journey. Harrison, darling, she called, extending her gloved hand with practiced grace. Welcome to Colorado, Miss Whitcomb, he replied formally, bowing over her hand. Lillian's eyes swept the dusty street with poorly concealed disdain. How rustic, she murmured. Her gaze suddenly sharpened as Sarah hurried past, clutching her flour package. And who is that? Lillian asked, her voice dripping with contempt. She turned to Harrison, her perfectly arranged features twisting into a sneer. So this is the creature who begs at your feet? The town is simply buzzing with the tale. Sarah's steps quickened, her cheeks flaming as she heard the cruel words. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel Miss Whitcomb's scornful gaze following her retreat. The package of flour pressed against her chest couldn't hide her pounding heart as she hurried away, fighting back tears of humiliation. Harrison watched Sarah's departing figure, an unexpected surge of protective anger rising in his chest at Lillian's casual cruelty. But he remained silent, bound by the proper manners that governed his class, even as something inside him rebelled against the injustice of it all. The Sunday morning church bells echoed across the settlement, their deep bronze tones calling the faithful to worship. Sarah helped her mother along the muddy path, both of them wrapped in faded shawls borrowed from kindly neighbors. Margaret's steps were slow but steady, her recovery progressing with each passing day. The little wooden church stood proud against the cold morning sky, its white painted boards gleaming in the pale sunlight. Inside, the congregation divided themselves according to the unwritten rules of society. Wealthy ranchers and merchants in the front pews, working folk in the middle, and the poorest families, like the Mays, near the back. Sarah and Margaret settled into their usual spot, the rough wooden bench creaking beneath them. From their position, Sarah could see Harrison Caldwell's broad shoulders in the front row, Miss Whitcomb beside him in an elaborate blue silk dress and matching bonnet. The sight made Sarah clutch her borrowed shawl closer. The preacher stood at his pulpit, his stern face surveying his flock. "Today," he announced, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we shall lift our voices in praise. Who among you will lead us in song?" A moment of silence fell. Margaret's elbow gently nudged Sarah's side. "Go on, child," she whispered. "The Lord gave you that voice for a reason." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as she slowly rose. Whispers rustled through the congregation like wind through dry leaves. She made her way to the front, each step feeling like an eternity, keeping her eyes fixed on the worn floorboards. Standing before the congregation, Sarah closed her eyes and drew a deep breath. Then, pure and clear as morning light, her voice rose in the opening notes of "Amazing Grace." The familiar words flowed from her heart, carrying all her hopes and fears, her gratitude and trust in divine mercy. The church grew still, all whispers fading to silence. Even the children stopped fidgeting, caught in the spell of Sarah's song. Harrison Caldwell leaned forward in his pew, his usual mask of careful indifference falling away as wonder crossed his features. Miss Whitcomb's perfect smile tightened at the corners, her gloved hands clasping tightly in her lap as she watched her betrothed's reaction. When the last note faded, silence held for a heartbeat before the congregation stirred. Sarah opened her eyes to find Harrison's gaze fixed upon her, something warm and appreciative in his expression that made her cheeks flush. She hurried back to her seat, where Margaret squeezed her hand with pride. After the service, the congregation filed out into the crisp morning air. Sarah and Margaret waited near the back, as was proper, while the wealthy members departed first. To everyone's surprise, Harrison paused in his exit, Miss Whitcomb's hand resting possessively on his arm. "Miss May," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the Sunday quiet, "your singing was quite remarkable. You have a true gift." Sarah curtsied, her borrowed shawl slipping slightly. "You're too kind, Your Grace." "Not at all," Harrison replied, ignoring the way Miss Whitcomb's fingers tightened on his sleeve. "I speak only truth." The exchange lasted mere moments, but Sarah could feel the weight of every eye upon them. Town gossips huddled nearby, heads bent close together, whispering furiously. Miss Whitcomb's perfect features arranged themselves into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Later that evening, in their humble cabin, Margaret sat in her rocking chair while Sarah prepared their simple supper. The day's events had tired her mother, but a gentle smile played about her lips as she watched her daughter. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child," Margaret said softly. "He places people in our path for a reason, though we may not always understand it at first." Sarah stirred the pot of beans slowly, remembering the warmth in Harrison's eyes when he praised her singing. "I don't know, Mama," she replied doubtfully. "Some paths are not meant to cross." "Perhaps," Margaret answered, her voice knowing. "But I saw how he looked at you today. That man heard more than just your voice, he heard your heart." Sarah said nothing. But inside, she held tight to the memory of Harrison's approving gaze, like an ember of warmth against the cold uncertainty of her world. The floorboards of the boarding house kitchen were rough beneath Sarah's knees as she scrubbed, her arms aching from the repetitive motion. Dawn had barely broken, casting weak light through the grimy windows, but she'd been working since before sunrise. Every coin earned would help keep her mother comfortable during her recovery. The soapy water stung the cracks in her hands, but Sarah kept scrubbing, humming softly to herself. The kitchen was empty at this early hour, though soon it would bustle with breakfast preparations. For now, the solitude was a blessing, allowing her to work without enduring suspicious glances or whispered comments. Heavy boots on the back steps made her pause. The door opened, bringing a rush of cold air, and there stood Harrison Caldwell, a covered pot in one hand and a paper-wrapped package in the other. Sarah scrambled to her feet, hastily wiping her hands on her apron. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy. "I didn't expect." "Miss May." He nodded, setting his burdens on the kitchen table. "I've brought some strengthening broth for your mother, and medicines the doctor recommended." Sarah's throat tightened at this unexpected kindness. "Sir, you needn't trouble yourself." "It's no trouble." His eyes fell to her reddened hands, and something flickered across his face. Without another word, he strode to the back door. "Where does your mother keep her woodpile?" "Behind the cabin, but—" Sarah hurried after him as he walked purposefully toward their modest home. "Your Grace, please, You can't mean to. But Harrison was already at the chopping block, removing his fine coat. Sarah watched in amazement as he rolled up his sleeves and took up the axe. The sharp crack of splitting wood echoed in the morning air. "Sir," she protested weakly, "what will people say?" Harrison paused, wiping his brow. "They'll say what they please, Miss May. I've learned that much in my years." He positioned another log. "Sometimes a man must do what's right, regardless of others' opinions." Sarah watched him work, struck by the simple dignity in his movements. After a while, she spoke softly. "It must be lonely, carrying such responsibilities." The axe paused mid-swing. Harrison's shoulders tensed, then relaxed. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "Though I suspect you know something of that yourself." Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding. Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a tentative trust beginning to bloom. The moment shattered at the sound of carriage wheels. Miss Whitcomb's elegant conveyance pulled up, and she emerged like a storm cloud in expensive silk. "Harrison!" Her voice cut through the morning air. "What on earth are you doing?" Her eyes raked over Sarah with barely concealed contempt. "Really, my dear, these charity cases of yours are becoming quite the talk of the town." Harrison straightened, his face closing off. "Lillian, I didn't expect you this morning." "Clearly." Miss Whitcomb's smile was sharp as a blade. "I thought we might breakfast together, but I see you're otherwise occupied with your philanthropic pursuits." Sarah's cheeks burned. She backed away, murmuring, "I should check on my mother." Inside their cabin, Margaret dozed fitfully. As Sarah arranged the wood Harrison had chopped, her mother stirred, then began to cough. The fit was harsh, racking her thin frame, and lasted longer than any before. "Mama!" Sarah rushed to her side, supporting her shoulders. "Here, drink some water." But Margaret couldn't catch her breath. The coughing continued, deep and wet, until Sarah's heart pounded with fear. She pressed a cool cloth to her mother's forehead, whispering desperate prayers. Through the window, she heard the clip of hooves as Harrison's carriage departed with Miss Whitcomb. Later, as twilight settled over the settlement, she caught a glimpse of him riding past alone, his shoulders bowed as if carrying a heavy weight. He reined in briefly, looking toward their cabin with an expression of such conflict that Sarah's heart ached in response. Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering night, leaving Sarah to wonder whether the warmth of their shared moment had been real or merely a dream born of wishful thinking. Her mother's labored breathing drew her attention back to more pressing concerns, and she returned to her prayers, pleading for mercy in the growing darkness. The autumn wind carried a bitter chill as Miss Whitcomb's servant hurried through town, a stack of carefully folded letters in his hands. He distributed them to the homes of the settlement's most prominent ladies, each envelope sealed with wax and marked "Urgent Matter of Moral Concern." Inside each envelope lay what appeared to be a letter in Sarah's hand, though Sarah herself had never touched the paper. The forgery was cleverly done, mimicking the unsteady script of someone barely literate. "Dear Duke Harrison," the false letter read, "I beg you to marry me, though I am far beneath you. My mother needs medicine and food, and we have no land to call our own. I promise to be a good wife if you will save us from poverty. Please help us, as no one else will." By midday, the town buzzed with scandalous whispers. Women gathered in parlors and on porches, passing the letter from hand to hand, their faces pinched with disapproval. "Such shameless begging, Mrs. Peterson," clucked her tongue. "To think she'd try to trap a nobleman. And him engaged to Miss Whitcomb," added another, fanning herself. "The poor dear must be mortified." The poison spread quickly. Where once Sarah had received grudging tolerance, she now faced open hostility. Shopping at the general store, she felt the weight of condemning stares. The shopkeeper's wife deliberately knocked Sarah's carefully counted pennies to the floor, letting them roll away under the shelves. "Oops," the woman said with false sweetness. "Better collect them all. Wouldn't want to waste money that could be used to buy yourself a duke." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she said nothing, gathering her coins with trembling fingers. She didn't understand the sudden surge of cruelty until Sunday morning, when everything came to a head. The church bells rang as always, but this time Sarah and Margaret were met at the door by Elder Thompson's wife. The woman's face was stern as she blocked their path. I'm afraid you cannot sing today, Sarah, she announced loudly enough for others to hear. Your presence has become problematic. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. What have I done? As if you don't know. The elder's wife thrust a familiar-looking letter at her. This shameful begging letter has been circulating all week. We cannot have such scandal in our congregation. Sarah stared at the letter, her vision blurring with tears. But I never wrote this. I would never. Come, Mama, she managed, turning to support her mother down the steps. But Margaret had gone deathly pale, swaying on her feet. My fault, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. All my fault. My sickness. Making you desperate. Bringing shame. No, Mama, please. Sarah tried to steady her mother, but Margaret's knees buckled. She collapsed into Sarah's arms, racked with sobs that quickly turned to coughing. Several townsfolk hurried past, averting their eyes. Only young Tommy, the stable boy, rushed forward to help Sarah get her mother home. Through it all, Harrison had been absent, attending to business in the next town. He returned that evening to fragments of gossip, whispers about Sarah's shameless pursuit and scandalous behavior. But without seeing the forged letter itself, he remained confused by the sudden shift in the town's attitude. In their small cabin that night, Sarah sat beside her mother's bed, holding her thin hand. Margaret had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep after hours of feverish weeping and prayers for forgiveness. I won't let them hurt you anymore, Mama, Sarah whispered fiercely, though her heart ached at what must be done. If we have to leave this town to find peace, then that's what we'll do. I promise. She gazed out the window at the stars, remembering how recently she had felt hope blooming in her heart. Now that hope lay crushed beneath the weight of cruel lies. Yet as she watched her mother's troubled sleep, Sarah's determination grew stronger. She would protect her mother's fragile health and dignity, no matter the cost to her own dreams. The night deepened around the cabin, and Sarah kept her vigil, her mother's hand clasped tightly in hers, already planning how they might slip away before more damage could be done. The morning sun cast long shadows across the market square as Sarah approached the bakery, coins clutched tightly in her palm. Her mother needed bread, something soft and fresh that wouldn't strain her weakened throat. But as Sarah reached for the door, Mrs. Baker herself stepped out, arms crossed. We don't serve your kind here anymore, the woman declared, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. Sarah's hand fell to her side. My kind? Girls who set their cap at the Duke, Mrs. Peterson called out from her vegetable stand. Trying to rise above your proper place. Heat crept up Sarah's neck as other vendors joined in, their voices carrying across the square. Shameless thing. After a nobleman no less. And him already promised to Miss Whitcomb. Sarah backed away, bumping into a cart of apples. The fruit scattered, rolling across the dusty ground as the owner shouted angrily. She fled, her empty basket swinging at her side, the sound of mocking laughter following her down the street. She had barely caught her breath when a heavy knock rattled their cabin door. Mr. Jenkins, their landlord, stood on the step, his face set in grim lines. Miss May, he said stiffly, thrusting a paper into her hands. Notice of eviction. Unless your back rent is paid by week's end, you'll need to vacate the premises. But sir, Sarah protested, we've always paid, even if sometimes a few days late. Times have changed, he cut her off. Can't have scandal associated with my properties. Good day. Inside, Margaret sat up in bed, her face drawn with worry. What was that about, child? Sarah crumpled the notice in her fist, trying to hide her trembling. Nothing, Mama, rest now. But across town, the situation was far from restful. In his study at the Grand House, Harrison paced before Miss Whitcomb, his expression thunderous. These rumors about Sarah May, he said. They're causing real harm. The girl can't even buy bread. Lillian arranged her skirts delicately. Perhaps she shouldn't have spun such tales then. Tales? Harrison stopped pacing. What tales? Oh my dear, Lillian's voice dripped false sympathy. Surely you've heard how she's been telling everyone you promised to marry her. For money and land? She produced a letter from her reticule. It's all here in her own hand. Harrison scanned the page, frowning. Something felt wrong about the neat script, so unlike Sarah's honest, direct manner. But doubt crept in. He was engaged to Lillian, after all. What if Sarah had misinterpreted his kindness? I need time to think," he muttered, turning away. Lillian smiled triumphantly behind his back. That afternoon, Sarah pushed through the crowd at the stagecoach office, keeping her head down. "2 tickets on tomorrow's early coach," she whispered to the clerk, sliding across their precious savings. "Please." The man eyed her suspiciously but took the money. "Dawn departure. Don't be late." As twilight settled over the cabin, Sarah and Margaret worked in silence. Their few possessions fit easily into one battered trunk. Margaret's mother's Bible, Sarah's best dress, the quilt they'd brought from back east. Each item wrapped carefully in paper, each memory folded away. "We shouldn't have to leave," Margaret said softly, holding her worn wedding ring. "This isn't right." "We have no choice, Mama." Sarah tucked the last bundle into place. "The whole town's turned against us, even the Duke." She swallowed hard. "Even he believes their lies." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "The truth will out, child. In God's time." "Maybe." Sarah forced a smile. "But for now, we need to rest. It's a long journey tomorrow." They settled onto their narrow bed, soon to be left behind as darkness crept in through the windows. Neither spoke of Harrison, or of the dreams that had briefly flowered in their hearts. Tomorrow they would start anew, somewhere far from whispers and lies, somewhere they could rebuild their dignity in peace. Outside, a chill wind rustled through bare branches, carrying away the last leaves of autumn. Inside the cabin, mother and daughter held each other close, their quiet prayers mingling with the night sounds of the Colorado settlement they would soon leave behind. Frost glittered on the empty fields as dawn painted the sky in pale strokes of pink and gold. Sarah May helped her mother navigate the slick boardwalk toward the waiting stagecoach, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter morning air. Margaret's steps were unsteady, weakened by illness and grief, but Sarah's grip remained firm and sure. "Look at them, sneaking away like thieves," someone hissed from the doorway of the general store. Other townspeople gathered in small clusters, their faces hard with judgment as they watched the pair's slow progress. Sarah lifted her chin, refusing to bow under their scrutiny. Her mother's trembling fingers dug into her arm, but she kept her pace steady, dignified. The driver had already secured their trunk, and now he extended a calloused hand to help them board. "Mind the step, ma'am," he said gruffly, but not unkindly, as Margaret struggled with the high carriage entrance. Inside, the leather seats were cold and cracked, smelling of dust and old tobacco. Sarah settled her mother near the window, tucking a worn blanket around her shoulders. Margaret's face was drawn with exhaustion, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The Lord sees all, child," Margaret whispered, patting Sarah's hand. "He knows the truth." The driver climbed onto his perch, and the coach lurched forward with a creak of springs and leather. Sarah watched through frosted glass as the only home they had known in Colorado began to slip away. Meanwhile, across town at the church, the preacher was already at his morning devotions when urgent footsteps echoed through the empty sanctuary. A serving girl from Miss Whitcomb's household burst in, her apron askew and face flushed with excitement. "Reverend," she called out, clutching a bundle of papers, "I found these while cleaning Miss Lillian's writing desk." The preacher rose from his knees, frowning at the interruption. But as he examined the papers, his expression changed from annoyance to grave concern. There, among discarded drafts and practice sheets, lay clear evidence of Miss Whitcomb's deception, attempts to copy Sarah's signature, early versions of the forged letter that had caused such scandal. "Dear God in heaven," he muttered, gathering the papers with trembling hands. Without pausing to don his coat, he hurried out into the cold morning air. The Duke's ranch house stood proud on a rise outside town, its windows gleaming in the early light. Harrison was already dressed, standing at his study window with a cup of coffee when the preacher's urgent pounding echoed through the house. "Your Grace!" The preacher burst in, scattering snow from his boots. "You must see this at once." Harrison's cup clattered against its saucer as he examined the evidence. The practice sheets showed Miss Whitcomb's careful attempts to mimic Sarah's simple hand. The final forged letter, the one that had poisoned the town against Sarah, was unmistakably written in the same practiced strokes. She lied, Harrison breathed, his face draining of color. Lillian engineered this whole scandal. The serving girl found these while cleaning, the preacher explained. She came straight to me, knowing the gravity of such deceit. Harrison crumpled the papers in his fist, self-loathing evident in every line of his face. I should have known. Sarah would never. He broke off, striding toward the door. The stage, what time did it leave? Dawn departure, the preacher called after him. Not 10 minutes passed. Harrison was already running for the stables, his boots crunching on frozen ground. His best horse, sensing urgency, danced sideways as he threw on the saddle. Within moments, they thundered out of the yard, hooves striking sparks from the frozen earth. Back on the stagecoach, Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, watching the town shrink behind them. The familiar shapes of buildings, the church steeple, the general store's false front, the livery stable grew small and indistinct through her tears. Margaret had fallen into an uneasy doze beside her, lulled by the steady rocking of the coach. Sarah clutched her mother's hand, trying to draw strength from the touch. Everything they had built here, every small comfort and connection, had been destroyed by whispers and lies. The memory of Harrison's face, distant and doubtful when last she saw him, cut deeper than all the townspeople's cruel words combined. Through mist-clouded windows, Sarah watched their world disappear into the pale morning light, certain that nothing would ever be the same again. Late afternoon sun slanted through the coach windows, casting long shadows across the worn leather seats. The steady creak of wooden wheels against rutted roads had become a familiar rhythm over the hours of travel. Sarah watched the countryside roll past, each turn of the wheels carrying them further from everything she had known. Margaret dozed fitfully against her shoulder, her breathing labored but steady. The other passengers, a merchant and his wife, a young schoolteacher, had long since fallen into drowsy silence. Only the occasional jingle of harness and the driver's soft commands to the horses broke the quiet. Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the town, to Harrison, to all that might have been. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass, trying to hold back fresh tears, when a new sound cut through the afternoon stillness, the distant thunder of galloping hooves. The sound grew louder, more urgent. Sarah sat straighter, her heart beginning to race. The merchant peered out his window, frowning. "Rider coming fast behind us," he announced, pushing his horse hard. A voice carried over the drumming hooves, deep and commanding. "Stop the coach! In the name of God, stop!" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. The driver pulled back on the reins, bringing the stage to a swaying halt. Dust billowed around them as a horse and rider drew alongside. Margaret stirred, blinking in confusion. "What's happening, child?" Before Sarah could answer, the coach door swung open. There stood Harrison Caldwell, his fine coat covered in road dust, his horse heaving from the chase. His eyes found Sarah's immediately, filled with an intensity that made her tremble. "Miss May," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "Sarah, I cannot let you leave like this." The other passengers watched in stunned silence as Harrison stepped back, then slowly, deliberately, went down on one knee in the road. Dust settled around him like a veil. "Your Grace," Sarah gasped, half rising. "The dirt your clothes." "Hang my clothes," Harrison declared. "Hang my title and my lands and all the empty trappings of wealth." His voice carried clear in the hushed afternoon air. "I've spent my life surrounded by people of high station, yet found myself alone. Until you." Margaret gripped Sarah's hand, tears beginning to stream down her weathered cheeks. The merchant's wife pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, eyes wide. "You showed me true riches," Harrison continued, his voice growing tender. "Not in fine things or social standing, but in the wealth of a genuine heart. In caring for your mother without complaint. In singing praise despite hardship. In facing scandal with dignity when others wronged you." He drew a deep breath. "I do not seek a wife of station, Sarah May. I seek a wife of character, of courage and kindness and unshakable faith. I seek you." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. "But what of Miss Whitcomb? The town's judgment?" "Miss Whitcomb's lies have been exposed. The preacher holds proof of her deception in forging that letter." Harrison's jaw tightened. "As for the town, let them judge. I would rather face their scorn with you than enjoy their approval without you." A small crowd had gathered, workers from nearby fields, travelers from the road. Their whispers rose like wind through grass, but these were different from the cruel gossip of before. "Look how he kneels," someone murmured. "A duke, humbling himself for love." Sarah felt her mother's gentle squeeze. "Go to him, child," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with joyful tears. "God has answered our prayers in his own way." With trembling fingers, Sarah reached for Harrison's outstretched hand. The moment their fingers touched, something electric passed between them, a recognition of souls meant to walk together. "Yes," Sarah breathed, barely able to speak through her tears. "Yes." Harrison rose, still holding her hand, and helped first Sarah and then Margaret down from the coach. Margaret wept openly now, her hands raised in grateful prayer. "Thank you, merciful heaven," she whispered. "Thank you." The gathered onlookers broke into spontaneous applause. Even the stage driver wiped at his eyes with a weathered bandana. Harrison paid him generously for the delay, then turned back to Sarah and Margaret. The late afternoon sun wrapped them in golden light as they stood together on that dusty road, three souls bound by love's power to overcome every barrier of class and custom. The winter morning dawned crisp and bright, snow blanketing the Colorado settlement in pristine white. Inside the church, dozens of candles cast a warm golden glow across wooden pews and holly-decked walls. Their light caught the frost patterns on the windows, turning them to delicate lace. Margaret May stood straight and proud despite her weakness, her daughter's arm linked through hers. Sarah's dress was simple white cotton trimmed with her mother's carefully preserved lace, but she wore it with the grace of any fine lady. A small bouquet of winter greenery trembled in her free hand. At the altar, Harrison Caldwell waited, his usual stern expression softened by joy. He watched Sarah approach with such open devotion that several of the town's most hardened gossips dabbed at their eyes. Gone was any trace of the proud, isolated cattle baron who had once cared so deeply about appearance and station. The preacher's voice rang clear through the hushed sanctuary. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." His words carried special weight, for he had witnessed both the cruelty of prejudice and the triumph of truth. When Sarah spoke her vows, her voice remained steady and sure. Harrison's deeper tones answered with equal conviction, his fingers gentle as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "What God has joined together," the preacher proclaimed, "let no man put asunder." Then came the moment the congregation had secretly awaited. Sarah turned to face them and lifted her voice in song. The hymn rose pure and clear to the rafters, a song of thanksgiving, of joy made sweeter by sorrow overcome. Even those who had once whispered against her wiped tears from their cheeks. Later, as Harrison carried his bride across the threshold of his sprawling ranch house, Sarah's laughter echoed through rooms that had too long known only silence. Margaret watched from her comfortable chair by the blazing hearth, her tired face glowing with contentment. The house that had once felt imposingly grand now felt simply like home. They gathered there in the warmth of firelight, mother, daughter, and son-in-law, no longer three separate souls divided by society's barriers, but a true family. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside there was only warmth, faith, and the promise of all their tomorrows together. Thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us who we are. If something touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that just might stay with you.